Hello and welcome to my presentation on how we can use scaffolding to promote the learning of SEN students in science lessons. So the rationale behind this presentation will follow three common themes. What is scaffolding, specifically looking at what written scaffolds are, what the literature suggests around using scaffolds, specifically looking at specialists within the field, and then having a look at written scaffolds in practice and how we can implement them more successfully. Firstly, we must understand what actually is scaffolding. So the EEF in 2020 summarised scaffolding to be a metaphor for a temporary support that can be removed when it is no longer required by the student. And it can be visual, verbal, or written. For the purpose of this presentation, we will be focusing on written scaffolds, specifically looking at long answers in science lessons. When having discussions with SEN specialists within my own academy, they outlined that effective scaffolding should identify specific barriers to learning, be adjustable for an individual group or individual learner, and have a time frame to be eventually removed. So what actually are written scaffolds? Now the picture here summarises what makes an effective scaffold. An effective scaffold makes all students equitable in learning, meaning they can be adjusted to depend on the amount of scaffold a student requires. So it's a tool which is implemented by the teacher to assist a student during independent practice. And examples of written scaffolds can include checklists, sentence starters, structure strips, keyword banks, and fill in the gaps. The purpose of a written scaffold, as mentioned, is to make sure all students are equitable, meaning that students may need additional support, and it allows us to close the gaps between lower and higher ability students. So here are just some examples of written scaffolds I have used within my science lessons. On the left, there are scaffolds for practical science, which show individual steps a student must take in order to be successful in that practical. There are structure strips, which are like a checklist, but they are dual coded to help the student remember the knowledge required to access that task. And then there are more standardised checklists, which have got sentence starters built in. So what does the literature actually say about scaffolding? So in Hattie's Visible Learning meta-analysis in 2012, he suggested that scaffolding has a really high impact on student outcomes, and it was actually ranked as the 16th most successful practice in performing attainment out of 252 classroom strategies. Rosenshine, in the Principles of Instruction, argued that scaffolding is required for difficult tasks to reduce cognitive overload, to reduce the demand on learners. And this has been found many, many times in different literature as shown on the screen. Now the EEF emphasises that scaffolding should be a temporary support and it will need to be removed or reduced to allow students to eventually gain independence and complete tasks, a finding which many teachers and many practitioners also believe in. Fisher and Frey suggested that scaffolding actually becomes more superior when it's used alongside gradual release AFL strategies, such as mini whiteboards or think pair shares, because it allows the teacher to identify which student needs to have a scaffold or what type of scaffold the student requires. So how can we actually implement scaffolds more successfully? So the first way is to actually pre-plan your written checklist. So not doing it off the cuff. So if you pre-plan a checklist, you know exactly what the student needs. Having it printed can actually avoid split attention, especially for these SEN learners who often can't focus on multiple areas within a room. Having a square will assist in self-regulation. Once a student has completed one part of the checklist, they can tick it off. Having it colour-coded to make sure it's ASD friendly allows the student to see what the main point is and what the following on points are if required. And having the checklist be explicit to the core ideas or skills within the scheme of work. So here we can see an example from my Year 11 bottom set class where the printed out checklist is on the left. And what you can see here is the student has actually used the square to assist in self-regulation. They have ticked off when they think they have accessed or written that part of the answer. It was printed to avoid split attention, because often what I found was if you put the checklist on the board, the students spend more time looking up and down to try and write and then look back up. But having it right next to the work allowed them to write more fluently. You can't see this on the screen, but this was actually colour-coded. It was a lighter colour underneath where the key words were to allow it to be more SEN friendly. And these core ideas were taken straight out of the AQA scheme of work to allow the student to be successful. So how can we actually implement scaffolds more successfully? And it all comes from Fisher and Frey's ideas of using a diagnostic tool to check who needs a checklist. So this could be either through mini whiteboards or it could be through a think, pair, share. And then what this allows is the teacher to choose who actually gets the checklist or who can have a redacted version of a checklist. So this would then be improved by live marking, monitoring the students' progress, getting them to tell you where they think the marks are, and then doing further diagnosis to eventually remove or reduce that scaffold. Because what I found was actually knowing when to remove the scaffold was the hardest part, but by using these diagnostic methods in parallel with the checklist, it allowed them to reduce or remove the checklist overall. And we can see that here with my Year 10 Mixed Ability triple group. So student 1 never received a scaffold because what this student had in their diagnostic was accurate answers, a high level of detail, so they did not need that checklist. Previously, I would have gave that student a checklist without that diagnostic, which actually, in hindsight, would weaken their learning. Whereas student 2 and student 3, during the diagnostic, their answers were not as detailed, not as in-depth, so they received this structure strip here. And as you can see, it follows the exact same themes as the checklists. The only difference with this one is that it is dual-coded. Now, the reason why this is dual-coded is because the lesson was on monoclonal antibodies, which is a very, very complex topic which requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of keywords. So without the dual coding, it would have increased cognitive load massively. So it's just another way of helping an SEN learner. And as you can see, all 3 students were successful in completing that task.